What a joy. Tamar, Dr. T, as I know you, welcome to the lockdown sessions.
Hi, thanks, Brad.
How are you, first of all, before we go into what you do and who you are?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm very well.
We've just been chatting offline. I just said to you, so how do I actually announce you? Because I've known you for years. We first actually came into knowing of each other, I think, during football times. You played on an opposing team that in the same league as my football team did.
Yeah, it was
And
great rivalry.
it really was. It was like North London rivals, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was always very combative when we came together. Even in like, I think we used to get involved in the summer league as well, where we would play against each other, and it was equally combative on AstroTurf as it was on grass. But professionally, you're a GP. You're also part of leading a quality improvement team as well within this, something you were sharing. But as a GP, you'd have been front and center over the last year. And these lockdown sessions have been a chance to kind of get people into the sessions to talk about what they've experienced and learned over this. And we've not had any doctors in the room. So I was talking to an advanced clinical practitioner the other day because he's my neighbor. And he was highlighting some of the stories that he's confronted in the general hospital he's been in. As a GP, though, what have your observations been? Because you're also part of a family, so you've got a home life. There must be so, I don't know where you want to start, but like, what has the observations been when you look out at the world and you see, based on what you do, like, what have you noticed?
I think probably this pandemic has just amplified and accentuated the huge diversity and extremes at either end of people's behavior. So, from thinking about people's approach to catching COVID, we've had people feeling so scared, patients so scared, often with great reason to be. I mean, everyone's got great reason to be, but often thinking about risk factors, often that fear is sort of feels proportional to individuals' risk factors, but often not. There's been a huge variety. Then the flip side of that, in brazenness, in people. I've met so many, and again, it's totally unpredictable. So the other day I saw a young, fit, healthy 23-year-old who'd literally, an IT analyst patient who'd literally spent the last few months in his home. And I was sort of questioning him. He came in with a musculoskeletal condition, and I was questioning him about his activity levels and how sedentary he'd been. And he said that he was leaving his home, his family home, maybe once a week to go outside. Wow. A fit 23-year-old guy. You're thinking, why? Like, there has been lockdown, but we've always been able, even in the height of the first lockdown, to exercise for an hour a day. Like, why are you not making the most of that, maintaining your physical condition, fitness, mental health, well-being? And then you've had other people who have meant to be shielding, have loads of risk factors, who have like brazenly been kind of ignoring the recommendations. I think in both my jobs, well, I suppose both professionally and personally, I think the pandemic has, the crisis sort of level that we've been operating on has often brought out the worst in people as well, in terms of how people have behaved to each other. I guess there's a level of, anxiety and stress that brings that on. But also, again, the flip side of that is how, a huge amount of kindness, compassion, consideration. Where I work in my GP practice in the initial lockdown, we had colleagues from other GPs to the receptionist going well out of their way to serve our population, even sort of going and doing shopping for people, when there were voluntary organizations that were set up very quickly, and pharmacy organizations that were delivering drugs, in the sort of hiatus between lockdown and that sort of infrastructure being set up, we were doing a lot of that kind of pastoral or community care for our patients, and obviously not to mention neighbours here on a personal level, people doing kind things for each other and supporting each other and looking after each other. So I think, the crisis brings out the best in some people and brings out the worst in some people, and actually probably one person is the worst of themselves sometimes and the best of themselves at others.
I do have a sense that at the beginning of this, the levels of global empathy and compassion escalated exponentially. As we've gone through second and then third lockdown, as people have become less patient with the rules or their lack of freedoms as they perceive it, they become far less compliant. As a doctor, though, it must be excruciatingly frustrating to see people, you use the word brazen. Do you say something, or do you just have to bite your tongue and just suck it up?
On a professional level, I have tried to say, crazy stuff. So like speaking to people, I spoke to a patient who's works in the media, intelligent woman who has school-going children, and this was a few months ago, so I can't remember exactly when, but maybe December, January, definitely still the height of this third wave, who actually phoned about a musculoskeletal problem, so something completely different, and then happened to mention that the week before she'd had a few days where she'd been bedridden with a fever. And so I said, well, so what's your COVID status? And she was like, oh, I didn't get a test. This woman works, in the media. And I was like, but you've had a new fever. I didn't have a cough, though, she said. And you're thinking, you cannot claim ignorance here, love. You cannot. There is just a level at which people put their head in the sand because it didn't suit them to stop working, to stop sending their kids to school, to self-isolate, all the rest of it. So there have been times, and another time I spoke to a chap who phoned with his cough, and I asked him again about his COVID status, and he was like, I haven't got one. And I challenged him and he hung up on me. And that thing has, but it's always really hard because you've got the doctor-patient relationship to maintain. So, you don't really want, you want people to feel able to access healthcare and not to feel judged. So it's difficult doing sort of challenging without coming across judgmental, especially when actually I think personally it was really hard to remain judgment free when we have had other patients who've been seriously unwell, and we've had several patients die, quite a few patients die from COVID. So these, you do feel if people are being irresponsible, not for themselves, people can make their own choices, but for the wider community and towards others, that, at what point do you have permission as a healthcare professional to sort of let someone know that there is a societal judgment to what they're doing or not doing?
Well, no one will appreciate it when you do it. That's the thing.
I also did a few voluntary shifts at Royal Free Intensive Care over this last wave when they were really struggling. They had sort of tripled or quadrupled their intensive care capacity. And I did some.
This is just for people who aren't from London. This is a North London, the biggest North London hospital, I sense, for people coming in or either from central London or from North London. The Royal Free is right bang in the middle of Hampstead, and is a one of the key hospitals, isn't it, in London?
Yeah, it's quite a big trust, and it's one of the big teaching hospitals. Okay, yeah. It's probably not the biggest, that's probably University College Hospital, but it's one of the biggest in North London alongside the Whittington. And their intensive care, I think they had 4 times the number of beds in all different parts of the hospital. And I volunteered something called the family liaison per doctor. So going to the ward rounds for the intensive care, and then phoning relatives of people who had COVID, who are in intensive care, and giving them an update, which was quite a difficult emotional job, quite draining, wearing like full PPE, not just the PPE that I was used to wearing, but the full intensive care PPE. And I think the second shift that I did, which was of early February, happened to be a lovely day, sunny, fairly warm for the time of year. And I mean, I was on an intensive care that had sort of 12, 14 people, all really unwell, very, very sick. And I know, having gone back there a third time, that quite a few of them didn't make it. And many of them had been there for many weeks, and they were all, I went in January and most of the patients were in their 70s. The time I went in February, most of them were in their 50s or 60s, so young. And I left that shift at about 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday afternoon and drove up through Southend Green and Hampstead, which is quite an affluent part of London. Lots of coffee shops, bookshops, little sort of bespoke sort of boutiques, and it was on the border of Hampstead Heath, and it was rammed. It was rammed with people, and we were in the height of lockdown. This was like government orders, stay at home, right? Go out for essential shopping only. And it was rammed, and I was so angry, and I just wished that, obviously you can't do it because of patient confidentiality, but I thought if there was a big screen here and they were beaming out what was happening in intensive care, like what else needs to happen in order for people to understand what's going on here? The only time in the whole year where the roads have been completely dead, and I think everyone was obeying the stay-at-home orders, the only time were the 2 weeks that Boris Johnson was in hospital.
Right, because we were actually suddenly acutely aware that we all thought he was going to die.
Yeah.
So, and I've said all along, I don't want to get this at all. And I've understood that the whole point of lockdown is so that the NHS don't get overwhelmed. But that frustration that you talk about, I understand it, because even when I was walking locally here, like maybe we could go one village along, so I go to an estate there where I can walk the dogs, and you'd find, like there'd be 6 adults, 5 kids, 4 dogs, all walking together, and it's like, that's not 2 families.
Mm.
And there was one time where I actually was compelled to speak up because a woman on her own was walking past this group of people and commented that they were taking up the whole of the middle of the walkthrough, and actually they clearly were breaking the rules and should be just into. And as she walked past them, this group of people turned around and started abusing her, like just shouting at her and really being vile. I went, actually, do you know what? I turned around, I was kind of walking. I said, no, I'm sorry, actually, she's right. I can't let you say that. You're clearly not 2 families. Well, how do you know? I said, well, you're just not. You're 6 adults. 6 adults, 5 dogs, half a dozen kids. You're not 2 households. You're at least 3. You could even be 4. It's like, and I remember coming off the walk and thinking, shit, are we going to be like taking registers now?
Mm.
And who am I? Because, I drove up to get Oliver. So that was breaking the rules. Or I've picked Charlotte up. I mean, I could tell you it was mental health issues, but maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know anybody who hasn't broken the rules where they were able to justify that for themselves. That kind of, cognitive dissonance that people have. So I've tried not to judge. But if I was in the medical world, I'd find it impossible. Because I just want to metaphorically slap people and go, listen to what they're saying.
And what's been really interesting, and I haven't seen it sort of discussed in the medical press, in the non-medical press, on WhatsApp groups with other doctors, there's a public health rule which basically, or that's somehow entrenched in the law of the country, which I am allowed to, so there's only very specific conditions where a doctor is allowed to breach confidentiality, right? That if you believe that a patient is posing serious harm to themselves, if you believe that a patient is posing serious harm to others, and within that latter parameter is kind of enshrined, well, what's included in that is certain, so the knowledge that a patient is knowingly passing on certain communicable diseases. And I think it's just HIV and TB that are currently enshrined in the law, right? If you know that a patient has HIV and is engaging in behavior, risky behavior, where you think they are passing it, knowingly passing it on, you are able to breach confidentiality and tell the authorities. And no one, I mean, I'm not, saying for sure that should now also encompass COVID, but I haven't even heard the debate. No one's been talking about it. I suspect it would just be too hard and too overwhelming, because where would you draw the line?
Well,
but I spoke to a patient very early on last year who was again in his 20s. Again, he had like quite classic symptoms of COVID, and he was a telecoms worker, and he was still going out to work, and he justified it by saying, I work by myself, I'm the only person in my van and I'm outside. But he was still going out to work and coming into contact with people. In another family where the boy had symptoms and the dad was a bus driver. You're thinking, you're a bus driver, like this is so dangerous. Yeah. And of course I advised them from a health point of view and what the government, what the law was, and what the government, and it was law, I think, to self-isolate, but it's not been kind of, I'm just being surprised from a public health / legal perspective.
Yeah, and I think we've got some challenges ahead, because with what I'm hearing being talked about, I think we've got discrimination challenges to come, especially if we talk about certification or passports for vaccines, right? Because it's going to be, well, just like Brexit split the country, it will be vaccinations that will split the country.
I mean, this is a bit of a bugbear. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine, because I think in Britain we have very, and Europe, very strong views about and very suspicious views about the government and their use of data, but also we're very tightly attached to human rights and to civil liberties in a way that other countries aren't, right? Other countries are just rolling out this certificate. And my brother lives in another country, and in where he works, they're not allowing people back into the office unless you've got a certificate. You need to work from home. And there's all sorts of leisure facilities that are not going to allow people in. Whereas here, and I've got a really good friend who's a lawyer, a sort of health lawyer. He usually represents hospital trusts when there are sort of health legal cases, like cases of kids, parents of kids who don't want the ventilator turned off, those sorts of cases, and talked about this particular issue. And he was saying that not only is there sort of this very strongly wedded relationship to the Human Rights Act and civil liberties, but you'll get people who will challenge the courts, people who don't have a certificate, who haven't had the vaccine, who will challenge the courts about discrimination in their accessing of public amenities, civic amenities.
Right. So if I need to show my COVID status in order to buy a pint, that's challenging now.
No, that will probably be okay, because a pint is a pub which is privately owned. But if you have to show your COVID certificates in order to use the library or a school or the leisure centre or a publicly run facility or the park, or that's, I think, where there will be huge issues.
And you're right, because in parts of the world where I travel to, you know, actually you can't travel there without a certificate to say you've had a vaccine. Actually, you need to get jabbed up in order to go anywhere. So I think in order to travel the world today, you probably need a COVID and an update each year, right? It just becomes like the flu jab, I suppose, where it changes and keeps evolving year on year. But I can see those human rights people actually jumping right on it. And there is a little point to it. You know, I'm aligned to the loss of freedoms. I'm challenged by the fact that when I look at numbers today, when we're recording this, and I compare it to, say, numbers 6 months ago, and I see that restrictions might be higher now than they were 6 months ago, I'm thinking, wow, okay. And then I'm hearing noises about, well, the variants, because that's going to set us back. And, you know, I travel for work. So from my perspective, I'm all right because my work translates online, but I would like to get back to global travel.
Mm-hmm.
And most of my clients aren't thinking about that till 2022. They want to see at least the next year of who gets vaccinated, how that looks, because they're not even sure certain countries will allow people in without a vaccine. What do they do, say, to their anti-vaxxer best sales guy sitting in Romania who now can't go to America for the sales kickoff because he won't have a vaccine? What happens then? So there's definitely challenges there.
But I think that's fine. People need to understand that their decisions, it's not just about them, it's about how they can impact on the world around them. In other words, pass on infection. And that's a part of the choice that they're making. That's their choice.
But we're not used to it being a binary choice here, right? Because everything was, you know, all I hear on talkback shows that I listen to is how Boris Johnson used to be renowned for being a libertarian. Now look at him, you know. And actually, when you think of all the money that the government did plow into supporting their population over the COVID, over the initial parts of the pandemic, and then in later months, whatever your challenges with it, they gave away money like they were a Labour government. I mean, it was billions flooding out. You know, they were reprinting money just to sustain the value of our pound. We're all going to pay for that.
Yeah.
You know, for years to come. So they've been knock on. I'm interested in the mental health stuff, T, as well, because you've talked a lot about the physical conditions and when people come in and present, who you've talked to, some of those frustrations. We talked about the white elephant in the room being mental health. Lockdown's downside is mental health. I've shared on previous sessions of these recordings that there have been moments when I've really struggled a year without seeing my family or really close friends. You're also a mum, so you've got a family at home, you're working as a doctor. What's your take on the mental health, the hidden mental health challenges that are confronting us now?
I mean, I think with the iceberg is, the tip of the iceberg is huge and it's only the tip. I mean, we've seen a massive expansion, a huge exponentially growing number of mental health problems in our practice with our patients. A lot of mental health problems now amongst teenagers, huge number. I mean, they have really suffered, I think, you know, a very formative time. For them, it's been exceedingly hard, very stressful, very all the uncertainty about the future with their exams, with their university, with their careers, with jobs. It's all sort of weighing down on them. So I think teenagers, young adults probably we've seen the biggest growth in mental health problems in that cohort, but everyone has suffered. And of course, you know, it's not news to talk about the increased rates of things like domestic violence, the increased alcohol consumption, the increase in suicide rates. So no change in, you know, psychosis, for example. So some mental health diagnoses have remained sort of, I suppose, static in prevalence, but certainly in mood disorders, stress, depression, anxiety, has been a massive impact, and substance misuse as well. And we'll be feeling that for years to come as well, I'm sure.
Does it put a real drain on you guys working in a practice? Because, you know, it's relatively new now, mental health, for people to talk about it, not new as a concept. And historically, if ever I had challenges as a child, you know, we go to the doctor, we tell the doctor, and the doctor recommends what could be the next step. But now there must be just, you know, floods and floods of people coming through the door, you know.
Yeah, and it's very hard because the support services haven't been there, or have paused, or aren't doing things the way they've been doing things. And, you know, they've also been very overwhelmed. So all the community mental health services, a lot of the third sector organisations, they might have been on furlough, they might have had to lay off people. So all of that sort of wider matrix of support has also shrunk and diminished. It's been, and then of course you've got the millions of people who are waiting for secondary care, for hospital appointments, for operations, for their physical problems, which then, when they're not dealt with, and people are having to then cope with, you know, amounts of pain, of, you know, physical symptoms, whatever they are, pain, immobility, debility, you know, dizziness, nausea, whatever it is, that then becomes sort of translates into mental health problems, because it's so hard for them to carry on their normal everyday life. So it's complete travesty.
No, and I've actually got personal experience of it, because my father, who had a pacemaker put in last January, so just before, 2 months before lockdown, so he has been shielding for most of the year, and he was struggling with something else to do with his breathing, and it's taken nearly 6 months until we actually got into a point last week where he's gone for a battery of tests, because they think they know what they're now looking for this diagnosis. Almost 6 months from the first time he's acknowledged it, started to talk about it, and actually it's made him quite low, because he would lose his breath walking from one room to the other, and it's like, that shouldn't be happening, and no one could quite come up with it, and then he was getting more upset. And I think there's this link, especially for people with any physical pain, that if it becomes chronic, that's just debilitating in itself, and then the mental strain. Do you think, when you look back to when you started as a GP, it seems as though what you trained for all those years ago, your job probably looks so different now to what it would have been 20 years ago when you were, or 25 maybe, when you were training?
It's so much of our job now is as GPs is actually around signposting and linking in with other services. So rather than having a patient, you know, present a problem and we try and fix it, now it's kind of utilizing all the other resources at our fingertips. And we've got all these new roles in primary care as well, like social prescribers and care navigators and community matrons and third sector organizations and advanced, you know, practitioners and paramedics, and all sorts of roles that now support GPs, and the sort of traditional roles of GPs and practice nurses and healthcare assistants. And we've got community pharmacists as well. So we've got all sorts of colleagues and team members who will see patients about specific issues, which is great. It's all because the demand seems to just be increasing and increasing, and obviously people are living longer, and people are more open about speaking about mental health issues, and there's a lot of deprivation, which leads to health issues, and you know, so there's a greater need.
We kind of come full circle, because we start out talking about sort of personal learnings, and then actually we start to see sort of the landscape is changing. So it's this volatile, uncertain world that we live in, but actually makes us really adaptive. So I always feel like it's a really a balanced question to ask you, but have you felt you've had to be adaptive in this last year? And if so, like, how have you adapted?
Oh, hugely. I mean, I think in general practice, most people will know, because most people listening to this will be patients themselves, although maybe not in the UK, but in the UK, as the pandemic broke, literally the next day, all general practices moved to remote access only, which means you can't book your face-to-face appointment to see your doctor. You have to first be triaged on the telephone. So that was a massive shift change, an abrupt shift change. So we've had to really change the way we work and, the systems in the practice and the operational stuff. And it's very different for patients as well to get their head around. So we're consulting everyone by phone. We might do a video, and then if we need to bring them in, we will do. We've got online access to GPs as well. And then in my other job, my quality improvement role, which we haven't spoken so much about, but we're sort of we have a series of projects that we work with GP practices with in Islington over the course of the year, different clinical projects. And again, we've had to be hugely adaptive there in terms of how we deliver our support for GPs and going to everything remote. And also sort of the fabric of the projects have changed. For example, we normally support practices in Islington to improve their uptake of flu vaccinations. And this year, sort of around June, when we were just coming out of the first lockdown, we realised that some practices would really struggle and be able to give their patients flu vaccinations because of the space and social distancing requirements and PPE and all the rest of it. And so we started to design and develop some hub flu vaccination clinics, which were when practices, we got a communal space, and actually one of those spaces was the sixth form college and another one was the Emirates community hub. And we put on joint sort of mass flu vaccination hub clinics where we would vaccinate 500, 600, 700 people in a day, all with social distancing, with stewards. And we worked with third sector organisations to put that on, and patients really, really loved it. But yeah, so that was all very, very different and very adaptive to what we normally do.
When do you sleep?
I think what it means is this
question.
You know how like in lockdown everyone's been watching loads of Netflix and we have too, and lots of TV and being able to do lots of cultural things. Or we've done like 50% of them. So people are like, have you seen this? And everyone's seen everything that we're watching now. They've seen it already.
So if I say, have you seen Queen's Gambit? Are you going to say yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good job. And did you enjoy it?
I enjoyed some of it. Actually, some of it I thought was, I enjoyed the storyline, the way it was filmed. I thought this woman character was filmed from a very male point of view, and was quite stylized, but in quite a sort of heteronormative way, which irritated me.
Yeah, I think from a D&I perspective, you could probably challenge it. I live with a 20-year-old female who highlights actually who's probably behind the camera by what she's watching on screen, with similar indignation as you've described.
Oh, good. I'm pleased it wasn't just us.
No. You're not on your own. You're not on your own. At the same time, I also think the character was one that was meant to push the norms, right? So it's kind of almost so much larger than life. She would be just ogled at, which is what I felt the film kind of positioned her as, this gorgeous non-conformist genius. But the acting I thought was special. I lied. I said I only had one last question, which was about your adaptiveness. Actually, I do have one last question before we push stop, and that is, could you describe like the best moment you've ever had in football, like as a footballer?
The best moment I've ever had?
Yeah. And for those listening while you're thinking, Tamar and I both played and managed and coached and worked with each other as footballers for a number of years. So this is more for my pleasure than perhaps even all of our listeners. But
I think it would tie. There's three that are really close. Can I give you my top three? I'll be really quick.
Go on, give me the top.
The first one was where I'm playing for my primary school. Bear in mind, I wasn't allowed to play as a girl in the primary school team in the league, because it wasn't allowed back then. So there was a lot of protest, but I was allowed to play in friendlies, and there was a tournament that I was allowed in, and I scored the winning goal of the tournament. So that was amazing. Then whilst I was playing for my Sunday league team, I scored an absolute screamer from the halfway line, literally. So it was a half volley. And you know, when they just come off your foot so sweetly, and it just flew, and the goalkeeper got no way near it, like went up and over and dipped over it. And it was made better by the fact that the coach at the time, like, wasn't my biggest fan, and and my teammates voted it as goal of the season, which was brilliant.
I think that's leading now. That's now leading in the league.
And the third was probably the moment that we won our European games together, because that was just so much hard work had gone into that over years, actually. And it was a sweet moment of victory.
And when you think of that sweet moment of victory, what's better, that or when you were able to give birth to your first child? We'll leave that one hanging. Tamar, thank you, not just for coming on and sharing some of your stories, but also for all the fact that you worked just so damn hard over the last year and helped, I imagine, so many people. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Brad.
Great. Thanks, T. I'll send you a link.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.